it is a fundamental reshaping of our thinking about reality, that there are other dimensional beings and that somehow there is enough compatibility between them and us that we could have offspring together.
It's the same sort of truth that the Word of God has contained within it all this time, but now we have this point in history where we're able to start looking at it differently. We're starting to understand creation differently. All the stuff that's being investigated with the paranormal and even the supernatural topics, transhumanism with the future, and there's this constant battle going on between God, His plan, and man through the influence of some nefarious angels and fallen divine beings to figure out that salvation on our own. And that's been the conflict all along.
Well, the central point is Saturn itself and the worship of the black sun. Those that practice the worship of the black sun, specifically Saturn itself, and the black cube, they believe that their leadership, that these gods, from Saturn itself, and that perhaps even to this day, that leadership resides within Saturn, effectively imprisoned within Saturn.
By the way, was Arthur C. Clarke on board with this idea? Because the original, his novel, 2001: A Space Odyssey, it wasn't Jupiter, it was Saturn.
That is correct. And the black obelisk, if you will,
right,
from his book was a rectangle, when in fact what he wanted to present was the black cube of Saturn.
But the problem with that is when these technologies that are already here now, when they become more mainstream, as Christians, we're going to have to answer some tough questions, like, where's the line? What's okay with God and what isn't?
The Bible is a cosmology book. It begins with God creating the heavens and the earth. It ends with a new Jerusalem, a new cosmos.
That was a compilation of some clips from a recent roundtable conversation that I listened to that was hosted by Derek Gilbert and comprised of Anthony Patch, Josh Peck, Gans Shimura, and Douglas Woodward, where they are all talking about a book which they collaborated together to write, titled Revising Reality, which just came out. It looks like through Woodward's Faith Happens publishing label. I can't really say for sure, but they've all come together, and this is volume 1, so presumably there's volumes to follow. It's really interesting discussion, and I do encourage everyone to go listen and check it out. I'll leave you a link. But the reason that I'm bringing it up is it's amazing how it really serves as kind of the perfect touchstone for kind of so much of what I've been thinking about and finding myself feeling lately. It was kind of a good lens, a good retrospective lens, actually, for my own self and work, if you want to call that, my research over the past year plus. As many of you know, I've done a number of videos featuring material from most of these, if not all of these guys. I don't know about Woodward, but I am familiar with him as well. And like I've mentioned before, there is a reason that I keep coming back to a lot of these figures, in the sense that for me, a lot of the things that they're actually talking about in this discussion and in this book were actually quite pivotal for my own journey of, once I encountered Flat Earth, started kind of unwrapping this idea of enclosed cosmology and all that sort of implied. I was really blown away, almost from the get-go, was how many of these things that they're talking about here. And it's amazing to hear Doug Woodward talking about cosmology, and the Bible is a cosmological book, and all these things. All these ideas of whether it's Josh Peck and higher dimensions and the multiverse, or the Genesis 6 paradigm, or the divine council idea, or everything with CERN and the possibility of a connection to Saturn with Anthony Patch, and the electric universe model. Of course, suddenly, when you look at them through the lens of the flat earth cosmology, a biblical enclosed cosmology, it really just ties them together in a way that, and that's what's so ironic. 2 years ago, if I had been presented with a chance to sit down and talk to any one of these guys for an afternoon or whatever, I would have been thrilled and probably had just 100 questions to ask them. And it's interesting to now kind of listen to them discuss these things, and I'm sure I'd still be interested in having a discussion with any of them if I had that opportunity, but it would be decidedly different. I would be unable to contain myself from pushing the cosmological discussion towards the ultimate ends that only the enclosed idea with a firmament and a flat plane truly brings you to. And that's what's so interesting now, is when I listen to this discussion, I'm very conscious of a number of disparate and conflicting paradigms that they're actually incorporating into different segments here, and seemingly no qualms whatsoever, such as Anthony Patch talking about electric universe, and apparently I was just looking at Doug Woodward's blog promoting this book, and he's talking about the electric universe model, and actually he's even talking about the ether, or you can talk about it as ionized plasma, is how I think Patch and them tend to describe it, but it's the same concept as ether. And so it seems like they are kind of gravitating towards a geocentric model, and that's encouraging. And but at the same time, then you've got Josh Peck, who will stand up and talk about quantum physics and quote things. On the one hand, he's questioning things from mainstream science and questioning what they're doing at CERN, but still not bringing it back to questioning everything, if that makes sense. The vast majority of what physicists and scientists are saying is still being accepted at face value, and it's just only sort of the peripheral details that are then being questioned, rather than just going all the way down to the foundations. And so yeah, you have electric universe theory and gravitational theory somehow coexisting in this discussion, in this book, and that's kind of bizarre. And so yeah, overall it's encouraging, because I definitely believe in all these I believe that there's definitely something to all of these we could call them paradigms or topics, chapters, in their compartmentalized sense, but they still have yet to really bring them together into a cohesive whole. But more than any of that, I think what it really boils down to is just the measuring line of, is there anything you're not willing to explore, anything you're not willing to question, anything you're not willing to consider, because deep down you're still trying to cling to a certain level or a certain semblance of credibility in the eyes of the world. And that's what's been hard. That's what's been the frustrating side of this past year and a half now. Whereas Gons, who's one of these authors, that's where I first heard about Mark Sargent and the Flat Earth Clues, and I didn't even really look into it at first. It took me a few months, and then it was actually when I listened to the interview with Rob Skiba and Josh Peck that I started to kind of look into it more deeply. But even at that point, I was really surprised why even Josh Peck himself was not asking all the questions in terms of hyperdimensions and all these things that we kind of refer to as being connected to quantum physics and things through the perspective of flat Earth. It's like suddenly, like he either couldn't connect the dots or wouldn't, and that's kind of been just the really agonizing thing, is to not really know if it's just people responding with the same level of resistance and programming that we all have, because we all grew up in school and we all learn the same things, and how much of it is added on top of that because deep in the recesses of their thinking they are aware of the fact that the tenure, I suppose you want to call it, the level that they've reached in terms of, even in a little niche community like Christian prophecy and fringe conspiracy researchers and authors and things. This book just kind of embodies that. All these guys collaborating together, two of which, Derek Gilbert and Josh Peck, now full-time staff at Skywatch TV, by Tom Horn's venture. And I started listening to PID radio and View from the Bunker years ago, and they were just broadcasting out of their house. And now they're on nationwide TV, and there definitely seems to be a line that has been drawn by anyone, especially associated with that sort of ministry umbrella, and they'll talk about cosmology, but then flat Earth is off the table, or at least they'll tell themselves that they've looked into it and explored it and just not convinced, and yet and it's hard not to conclude that has to play that plays a role. That there is a degree of influence and restriction, because that if you really cross a certain line where you start to not only question things like evolution and everything, but you start questioning even what NASA going to space, or Einstein's theory of relativity, or whatever, starting to question these quote-unquote fundamental building blocks of science, that you're going to pose a serious threat to your support base and your viewership. And you are no longer an independent researcher. You are no longer as objective. You are no longer looking at first and foremost, the Bible as objectively as perhaps you could be. Yeah, so that's been kind of the ongoing frustration with that, and honestly, it is tied into my own life and experience in a more pressing way. In the last few months, especially, there was a project that I was invited to participate on that has just now recently been released, which I won't mention by name, but I'm sure many of you know. And it was a very, very difficult decision. I'll be honest. I didn't make it lightly, but I wound up having to follow my convictions to pull out of that, and it hasn't been the easiest thing. Since I was very passionate about the subject of this documentary itself, and I wish it well, and I'm not trying to judge anyone or speak ill of anyone, so I have to be very, very careful here. But overall, I think I wouldn't be being true to myself if I didn't at least share a small word of caution to so many of you out there, so many people who I now consider friends and brothers and sisters, even though we hardly know each other in many ways, but united by so many of these truths that have been unveiled in the recent years, that there's a real danger in seeking the slightest measure of credibility in the eyes of the world. And that's the slippery slope that ever since I started doing this, tried very hard to steer as far away from as possible, and to not toy with that line of building myself up and making a name for myself, putting myself on any kind of pedestal, not to mention just avoiding monetizing videos, or doing a bunch of interviews, or just getting caught up in the whole circus of self-promotion. And for me, that's really the danger. So it's interesting when we can stop and look at these guys who I know so many of us have tried to engage with, and tried to show, and tried to say, hey, this really isn't as crazy. This actually makes more sense out of all the things you're talking about than you're able to make sense out of it. And yet you just pretend like it's not there. You just want to pretend like the conversation isn't even happening. And you just think that if you can ignore it long enough, it'll go away. And it's aggravating. But you guys, we're no different. We're no better. We're subject to the same pressures and the same pitfalls and the same temptations. We can be pulled in by the same false sense of credibility, wanting to be quote-unquote legit. Very few people sell out in one fell swoop, all in one motion. No, it's a progression of tiny little choices over time, tiny little steps. And everyone's got to decide between themselves and God where those lines are. But, for me, things like choosing to just use a safe term like cosmology instead of flat Earth in an entire documentary, even though I'm already out for flat Earth, it's a step backwards. You're censoring yourself and telling yourself that it's for the sake of opening other people's eyes, when in reality, at the end of the day, you're just limiting yourself to their restricted thinking. I can't abide by that. And so I hope that makes sense. I hope that it doesn't come off as judgmental or self-righteous, but it's something we have to be very careful of. So, because there's a freeing thing about letting the Bible just speak as plainly as it does, and not caring about what the majority thinks, whether it's the quote-unquote secular world or the quote-unquote Christian world. So